before that. I wanted to get back to kind of what matters most as I end my career there. So I'm back as a faculty member in the communication department. And my firm belief is that communication is the most important thing we can study. We all kind of assume that we know about communication because we grow up learning how to talk. You know, we don't really learn how to listen, but we hear. So we think, you know, that's listening, which it's part of the listening process. There are 4 basic communication skills, and they're speaking, listening, reading, and writing. And if you think about in school, the most emphasis is on reading and writing, right? Which is not to say that that should not be the case. And then occasionally we take a required class on public speaking, or in our high school English class we have to deliver a speech, and so we learn a little bit about that. And then almost never do we learn anything about listening, because we all can hear. And so there's that assumption that there isn't a lot of training that happens with the listening process. And so I like to give this kind of mini lecture about the listening process, just to remind us all, because as we think about it, we're going to realize, I know this, but I often don't remember to use it. And so what I want to do today is just spend a little bit of time, 20 minutes, talking about the listening process, pulling us back a little bit to the general communication process, and then reminding us of some things that we can do. Probably all of us, my husband reminds me I can do them better as well as listeners, because more of what we do in our daily activity is listening than it is speaking. So it's better to learn more about the listening process, especially given that it's just not really taught all that often. I had PowerPoint slides, and so I'm going to speak off my slides, but I did provide some handouts for you. What we tend to forget is how important it is for leaders, for anyone in a leadership position, to engage more in listening than we do, because so often we count on leaders to provide vision, to do day-to-day kinds of managerial kinds of things. And sometimes our leaders, and it's very prevalent in the media now, our leaders are not great listeners. And so it's hard to then reconcile what I should be doing differently if I'm not listening to what others are saying, either about me or are saying to me, or listening to experts who know more than I do, so that I can make a better informed decision. So for all of us, leadership, the critical aspect of that is listening, and it's something that, again, we take for granted because we know how to hear. The model of communication is probably worth just spending a minute or two about, because the model of communication, the way that we want to share meaning, which is what communication is all about, the process of sharing meaning. And very often we think of it as, I'm creating a message and I'm sending it to you, so there's a sender and there's a receiver. And we often think about it as kind of a separated sort of entity. We've got speakers and we've got receivers. And what we need to remember is we're doing both simultaneously. So as I'm sending messages, I'm watching what you're doing. And I mean, in a classroom, a college classroom, some people are going to be putting their heads down. Some, unless you've told them they can't use their iPhones, are going to be on their phones. But that's sending a message at the same time that I'm sending a message, if I'm the instructor, if I'm the professor. And so we are all doing that simultaneously. And the other thing we need to remember is there are things that cause barriers in the communication model, in the process. When someone walks by, I was momentarily, I don't know who it was, but I was momentarily distracted, right? That's all noise. So there's different kinds of noise. There's physical noise, there's auditory noise, there's all sorts of the temperature in the room. If this room were too warm, that would be affecting our ability to listen or to send messages. If the room's too cold, same thing. The fact that it's cold outside today is impacting our ability to share meaning with others. So the communication process, I would love it if it were more like math, where 2 + 2, if you're in base 10, is always 4. But communication isn't like that. And it's not like that for a lot of different reasons. Noise is one factor. Another factor is we all come to a communication interaction with different backgrounds, different experiences, different ways of looking at the world, and those all affect the way that we either send messages or the way that we receive messages. And the receiving part of the message is, of course, what listening is all about. So listening is basically the active process of making meaning out of another person's spoken message, typically spoken, but often nonverbal as well. what we need to remember about listening is that it is an active process. So often we hear things like, oh, sit back, relax, listen, just listen. And if I sit back and relax, especially after a meal, I do not listen well. I fall asleep. Or I start to do other things in my head because I'm not engaged actively in that process. So we need to remember that it's an active process, and what we're trying to do with listening is to create meaning from information that I'm gathering. So I'm listening to what someone else is, I'm hearing what someone's saying. I'm also paying attention to their nonverbals, because that typically conveys more of a message than the words. If someone says to you, yes, I understand, right? The words are, yes, I understand. If you just read that, you'll assume that that means that person understands. But if you pay attention to the nonverbal, the way that I relay that message, you would clearly interpret that to mean I did not understand, despite what I said, right? So the words can convey up to only 7% of a message's meaning. Up to 93% of a message's meaning is conveyed in some aspect of nonverbals. And that there's a variety of things that come into play there. Paralanguage, which is the way I say what I say, the yes, I understand. That's paralanguage. That's the way that I say that message can change the meaning of it. Or yeah, and I'm saying yeah, but now if I do yeah, and I do something different. Again, that's the nonverbal element of my facial features, my eye contact or my lack thereof. So all of that conveys meaning, and as a good listener, it's important for us to pay attention to all of those kinds of things. There are a lot of reasons why leaders and others don't listen, and I've got a list there for you, and it's on the handout. One of them is lack of training, and I've talked about that already. When we're kids, we learn to read and write, and then eventually we kind of learn to give a speech. We learn a little bit about speaking. We hardly ever learn anything about listening and what is involved in the listening process because we assume that it's built in. We assume that because I can hear, I can decode a message and I can make sense out of it. Unfortunately, that isn't always true. We also don't listen well because of self-defense. If you honestly tried to listen, even in this room, which is very, very quiet, if you try to listen to everything, just for a second, okay, hear noises there, right? You hear a fan or probably the heater. If an ambulance went by, you'd hear that. I mean, you've got to tune things out. We also tend to tune out what we don't want to hear. So that's selective listening. There's a lot of examples right now in the media, government, about selective listening, where you can see that people are listening to what they want. It's very easy for us to selectively tune into, especially right now, political messages. If you're on the far right, you may only watch Fox News. If you're on the far left, you might only watch MSNBC. Those channels tend to skew to those types of voters. We can selectively listen all the time, not just on TV when we're listening to politics, but we listen to things we like. When someone's giving us constructive criticism, we tend to not listen to that as well because we feel as though we're being attacked. It's a natural instinctive reaction. I've got a whole different lecture about that. But so we engage in selective listening. It's harder for us to listen to people that we love. It is. We tend to listen least to the people that we are closest to. And if you think about that, why is that? We know what they're going to say. We know them really well. We know what they're like. We know what they're going to say. It's really easy to tune them out because you only have to kind of listen halfway. You can focus on something else while they're speaking, but that tends to be the case. We tend to listen better to people that we don't know because we're trying to then figure out where they're coming from. The other people, we know where they're coming from. I don't need to listen to my daughter complain about something else again. She's been doing that all the time. That kind of thing. So we selectively listen. There is something called thought-speed ratio, which helps us also explain why we don't listen well. Thought-speed ratio is the idea that people speak at an average of 125 to 175 words per minute. So when someone is talking, they're talking at about 125 to 175 words per minute, sometimes faster, sometimes slower.
They are from the South, evidently.
Then it's really slow, then it's even slower. We have brain capacity if someone could speak at 500 to 700 words per minute, we could internalize those messages. It would take all of our brain capacity to do it, but we have the ability to hear and understand 500 to 700 words per minute. Nobody speaks like that. Occasionally you can hear commercials where they speed up.
Right.
Yeah, the person started speaking the same rate, but then they compressed it without them sounding high-pitched. There's technology that can do that. But so when people are speaking, and we can think about this even right now, what are we doing? We can't just focus on the message because we've got this other brain capacity. So we're thinking about, okay, what do I need to do as soon as this is finished? You know, is my meter going to expire? We're thinking about all sorts of things. Sometimes we're thinking about the message. Sometimes we're internalizing it. We're trying to spend a little bit more time. We're writing notes. That takes some of that brain capacity. But more often than not, because we've never learned that, we're doing other things with that extra brain capacity. And so we're unable to focus as much on the message as we wanted to. Audiovisual distractions, and we talked about that when we talked about noise. That's a huge factor that adversely impacts our ability to listen. Relationships, I touched on that as well. We tend to listen least to the people with whom we are closest, and that is a sad reality that has been borne out time after study after study. We also listen in terms of our feelings, attitudes, motives, and experiences. So FAME stands for feelings, attitudes, motives, and experiences. And that's the only way we can listen, because we all have different feelings that we've established throughout time about certain things. We have motives. We have reasons why we are engaged in that conversation with someone. It might be a very altruistic motive. It might be a manipulative motive. But we bring that to the table when we're engaged in listening. Attitudes, I missed attitudes, feelings, attitudes. We have attitudes about things. You know, we talked about the Fox News and the MSNBC. I personally will listen to one and not the other because the other drives me crazy. I'm not telling you which one, but we all tend to be like that if we have strong views. We listen based on our attitudes. Our attitudes are often shaped by our parents or our other early experiences. None of us was born bigoted. We learned it somewhere. And maybe it wasn't from our parents, but we learned it somewhere. And we all have biases. We're all bigoted about certain things. Some people won't drive a Toyota or a Chevy. I mean, we all have biases about certain things. And those are things that we've learned. Those are attitudes that we bring to us in any sort of communication setting. And experiences, that's the other thing. So we've had experiences about either the people that we're interacting with or, you know, whatever. And those come into play when we are trying to listen to someone. So you can see that there's a lot of problems that come into play. And the process of sharing meaning is, you know, I send a message and you try to decode that message. That is fraught with potential problems as well. I'm going to give you one example. Let's say that we get on I-75 and I'm your passenger, you're driving, and we're heading northbound. And we're at, let's say, I'm making these up because I don't remember the exit numbers. Let's say we're at about mile marker 59. And there's an exit coming up at mile marker 60. And then there's another exit, let's say mile marker 62. And I say to you, you know, would you mind stopping? I need a cup of coffee. Would you take the next exit? Okay, how many of you would take the exit, if you were driving, the exit closest to where we are right now? Most of you, right? Most people take this coming exit. Hardly anybody would wait and then take the following exit. Okay, so it's Thursday, right? Today's Thursday.
According to how fast you drive.
I'm sorry?
According to how fast you drive.
And yeah, and that's exactly right, though. That's another factor. That's part of what you're bringing to that scenario.
I look for signs that says, like restaurants or coffee before I pull off.
Okay, and that'd be another factor that would come into play, right? Okay, so today's Thursday. I say to you, do you want to go out to dinner next Saturday? And you say, yeah. Next Saturday, for how many of you would that be 2 days from now? Yeah, for most of you it wouldn't, right? Okay, for some of you it might. But therein lies another problem with listening. The same word, next, the word next, depending on the context, means either the one closest to or not the one closest to, because next Saturday, according to the next exit, would be 2 days from now. But
This
almost
Saturday.
right. But almost none of us would assume that that is what is meant by next Saturday. We would assume
A week.
January 20th. Yeah, a week from this coming.
Saturday,
Right. But it's the same word. And it has two very different meanings.
That's different.
Right. And there are lots of words that I did not have to reach very far and wide to figure out a word that did that. Semi-monthly and bi-monthly is another example. If someone says to you, I need a semi-monthly report, is it 6 times a year or is it 24 times a year? There's a big difference. Bi-monthly reports, same thing. And honestly, it does not matter what the dictionary says because we don't carry dictionaries. Well, we actually do now with our phones, but we don't use them.
Yeah.
What's important then to remember is that my experiences with the word next have caused me to know that I don't ever use it like that. I say this coming, right, to clarify it, or not this coming Saturday, but the following one, or January 28th, or whatever, to try to make the message as clear as possible. And as a receiver, as a listener, we need to do that as well. But it's too easy not to, because we've got our feelings, our attitudes, our motives, and our experiences, and they are all coming into play. So I know that you don't mean this coming Saturday, but sometimes people do. Yeah.
When you said that people usually speak at 125 to 175 words per minute, that's what gives you time to process what they're saying.
When you're doing it well.
When you're doing it well. But,
Yes.
you know, the 500, 700 words a minute, you can't even absorb that.
Right.
And I have been in situations where I'm about 2 lines behind whatever they're saying because it's taking me that long to catch up to what they are thinking. And so I'm listening with one side of my brain so I can hear it, so I can figure it out in a couple minutes. And with the other side of my brain, I'm processing what they just finished saying because I didn't understand it.
Yeah.
But if I think about it in a minute, it makes a lot more sense. And then, so
Yeah, so sometimes we end up a step behind, even though we're trying really hard. Can I get my water? Would you mind handing me that? We're trying really hard to be good listeners, but it becomes even harder still because then we want to use that brain capacity to focus on the message and to decode it and to take time with it, and the person is going on, and so we haven't had that ability.
Well, here's the other thing. Like us older, mature people, our brains are at capacity because we know so much that it takes us longer to absorb, just like a computer.
Right.
The more it has in it, the slower it gets.
Yeah. And I think there are studies, someone was talking about memory issues, Alzheimer's issues, and I have a mother who has recently been diagnosed with moderate dementia, and it's so much harder for me to just keep that focus. I don't know, it's because we listen at least to the people that we're closest to, I'm sure that's what it is, but it's really hard to keep in mind. I think it would be easier if they were not my mother.
Right.
To do a better job of trying to ensure that we're sharing meaning. And that's more me as a sender than as a receiver, but it's the same kind of thing. She can't process the information as quickly as she used to be able to. So I get frustrated because I didn't used to have to say things slower or wait longer or whatever. Yes, and it becomes a very frustrating process.
One of the things I don't see in there, which affects me, and Carol will tell you this, is that, I'm distracted because I'm internally arguing or having ideas relative to what you're saying.
Yes.
So I'm focused on
The
what
reply.
you said earlier, either my clever comment or the correct answer or whatever, while you're moving on.
I owe you money because that's the last thing. That's ego.
Oh, that's ego.
That's another reason why we
I'm
don't
just
listen.
certain it's
that
not
was
ego.
perfect. Oh, I'm sure that's right.
And I got it on tape.
But it's and that's
pay him, it'll be
the
awful.
question is, am I listening or am I waiting for my chance to speak?
Yeah, okay.
Right? Yeah, because I've now started either debating you in my head or I know what the right answer is. And sometimes you can almost see people who are just dying to get their word in because they've moved beyond what you're saying to either constructing the correct response or knowing a little better or having the right answer. It's that kind of thing. So it's and in this, it's not necessarily ego, but the way this researcher developed it, it was my ego gets in the way of my ability to listen effectively. So the question becomes, am I listening or am I waiting for my chance to speak? So it is important that we watch out for that. Part of it is still listening, but then I've gone beyond that because now I'm creating how I'm going to respond to whatever that person is saying, and then I've dropped the ball and have ceased listening. Yeah. So there are some misconceptions about the listening process as well. There are assumptions that lead people to overestimate their listening skills. People think that hearing is the same as listening, and it's not. Hearing is the first step of the listening process, but hearing is just the first step. You have to be able to hear to listen to the words. You don't have to be able to hear to listen to the nonverbals, but you have to be able to hear. We think that listening is natural and effortless because we take it for granted. Because we can hear, we take for granted that we're listening. And we also, a misconception is that all listeners hear the same thing. And there are so many times where if you ask 3 different people what was said, you could get 3 almost completely different answers. Or how they reacted when they said it, what they thought. If you add any of those elements into it, it broadens still what you might have interpreted that message to be. So those are some common misconceptions that we want to be sure that we're to remind ourselves of. And on the back, and I know this print is really small, but
It's okay, it's great to have.
yeah, that's what I thought. I thought it'd be better, and if I could keep it on one sheet. So there are stages of the listening process, and that's what's on that next slide. Hearing is the first step. You have to be able to hear. My husband is sometimes convinced that I have a hearing disability. But I know what happens is when I start reading something, I get totally engrossed in what I'm reading, and he can say anything. My kids, they know this by now. They've got to get me to focus away from whatever it is that I'm reading or doing to then focus on the message. So hearing is the first stage of it. Understanding is the next stage of the listening process. I've got to be able to hear, and then I've got to be able to be sure that I understand what you meant. So when you say next Saturday, did you mean what I would assume, and not this coming, but the following? So I need to be sure to take some steps to be sure that I am understanding and I'm decoding that message the way you intended for me to. And then remembering is part of the listening process. If I didn't hear it, I'm not going to be able to remember it. If I heard it but didn't understand it, I'm not going to remember it well. So I need to hear it, I need to understand it, and then I need to remember. And then there are 3 other elements to it as well. Interpreting is part of being sure that I understand what you meant. So it's part of that understanding, but it's understanding from your perspective. And then I can't see those either. Evaluating. In evaluating is a certain kind of listening that we don't all have to engage in, but evaluative listening is where I'm deciding whether or not I believe you. We engage in evaluative listening when we're listening to candidates, maybe that we want to decide for whom to vote, or if we really are not sure that someone is being accurate, we're engaged in critical listening and evaluative listening, so we're evaluating the message. And then the final step in the listening process is the model where I become the sender once I've been the receiver, and I'm kind of doing it simultaneously, but responding to be sure that we're talking about the same next Saturday, or the same next exit, or the same semi-monthly or bi-monthly, or low. The word low has 26 different definitions in the dictionary. What do you mean the sound cattle make? Do you mean cheap in price? Do you mean close to the ground? I mean, there's a lot of different things that any of those words can mean. Okay, so, and then there are different types of listening. Appreciative, are those on there, or did I?
Yeah.
Okay, appreciative listening.
Informational, critical.
So appreciative listening is if you go to a concert and you're listening to music, something like that, or you're listening to a lecture where, and I'm thinking of someone like maybe a David Sedaris, or someone a humorist, or a Baumbach kind of thing. You're just listening because you're enjoying that. That's a different type of listening than informational listening, where I'm listening because I need to have information. The easiest type of informational listening example is where I am asking someone for directions. we don't have to do quite as much of that now because we all have also a map on our phone. But if you're trying to be sure that you understand where someone is telling you to go, that's a clean example of informational listening. Or to learn something about, the person who was talking, the speaker who was talking about their Alzheimer's research, is that what it was? That's typically informational listening. She's established herself as a credible speaker. You're listening to glean information to learn something new. Critical listening is also called evaluative listening. So critical listening is where I really am listening to try to see whether or not I agree, or if there is something that is not accurate in what that person is saying to me. And there again, that requires different kind of responding skills in that listening process. And then finally, empathic listening. Empathic listening is probably something that a couple of you know very, very well. You're listening to help someone feel better, or to just be a shoulder. It's mostly to be a shoulder for them. Someone who needs to get something out. I mean, you probably do that a lot. And again, that doesn't require the same kind, requires different sets of skills. Some people are not good empathic listeners because they want to provide a solution. Right? Yeah. And sometimes that's not what the person wants. They just want to be able to vent or to share or to say something. And so I need to realize which type of listener I need to be in those specific scenarios. Often there are some gender issues related to listening. Men tend, not always, but men tend to be more focused on solving problems, which causes some problems in female-male relationships, because a lot of times females just want to be able to have an empathic listener rather than a critical problem-solving listener. And the flip side is true, but that's where it's important to try to figure out, why is it that you're sharing this information with me? Do you want me to help you solve a problem? Or do you just want me to be there for you, or to listen without judging? So it's important to think about what kind of listener do I need to be in this particular scenario.
It's always good to ask, would you like me just to listen?
Yes.
Or would you like some feedback?
It absolutely is. And sometimes we don't do that enough because we've got our backgrounds and experiences, and we know what they want. We are a problem solver, so we know that we're going to solve their problem.
Isn't there a T-shirt for that says, "I'm a guy, I'm a problem solver"?
Should be.
Should
Yeah, and it's not universal. And you hate to stereotype, but
it's more
the research,
accurate.
right?
Yeah.
The research shows that tends to be the case, more so than the other side of the equation.
Sometimes you have to say, don't solve this for me, just listen.
Right. That's exactly right. Yeah. In this case, I don't want a solution. I just need I need to vent for a little bit.
I don't know about everyone else's grandchildren, but they sit there
Yes.
and they don't talk to you or anything. They just
And they don't talk to
they
anyone.
don't talk to each other. They
Right. You can see kids who are friends sitting in the same room next to each other, not talking, communicating, but not talking. So they're texting, sending Instagram messages, those kinds of things, but they're not talking. And while that can be effective for some things, we still need to be sure we develop skills as senders and receivers of face-to-face messages, because the world operates still with many more face-to-face messages than we give them credit for. So we need to be sure that we develop those skills in everyone. The interesting thing about texting, though, is that requires more skill in the creation of a message, because you don't have the benefit as a receiver of the nuance. So I can't tell that you're being sarcastic unless you've added emojis, or something else, right? But if you just send a straight worded message, I don't see your nonverbals. I don't hear your inflection. I don't hear your paralanguage. So the meaning can be even more distorted. And sometimes if the message is conveyed without proper grammar or syntax or whatever, that bothers the receivers, and then it's hard to get that message internalized as well. So yeah, those things all convey a lot of different things and cause different problems in the process.
I know people have said that when they have a fight and neither one perceives themselves as being a good communicator, they go in separate rooms and text at each other. It's like, really?
Yeah.
Because you're missing everything if you do it that way.
Yeah, that's right. Remember, 93% of a message, up to 93% of a message is conveyed in something other than the words. So the
Yeah.
words, so you're relying on 7% of the wide ability that you have to communicate a message if you're only using the written words. Yeah, yeah. So
Terrifying.
It really is. It really is. Okay, so the three main focuses of becoming a better listener I'm going to focus on right now are to be a better informational listener. Remember, your goal is to understand. So if you want to be a better informational listener, the top right one there, your goal is to understand. So you want to focus on the substance of what you're hearing. You want to try to use active listening, which means you're doing just what Carol was talking about. You're internalizing the message as you're hearing it. You're organizing it in your head. You're also paying attention to the nonverbals. You're asking questions for things you don't understand about, and you're paraphrasing in your head as well. So you're using that thought-speed ratio. You're using that extra capacity that you have to try to be sure that you truly understand the information that is being presented to you. It's harder to do. It's because it requires active engagement, but it's certainly the most effective way to try to be a good informational listener. So to be a better critical listener, and critical listening is really hard because you're trying to determine and you're making judgments about what you're hearing. But a lot of times we need to assess the credibility of what you're hearing, of the information that you're hearing. So it's not bad to be a skeptic. You want to think about, is this credible? You know, there's a lot of discussion right now about alternative facts or fake news, and it's important for us to realize if what is being said to us is credible. So we want to evaluate the speaker's credibility. We want to think about the probability. You know, does this seem really probable that this is true? Does the person seem to relay? Are they using good, reliable sources for their information? Now, when we teach people about public speaking, we always talk about the importance of good source credibility. You know, use good research. There are some websites, you can find pretty much anything you want anyone to say on a website now. But so you decide, you have to look at, you know, what's the extension? Is it a .edu? That means it comes from an educational source. That's probably going to be more reliable than a .com, not necessarily, but you want to look at those kinds of things. You want to look at who's sponsoring the website if you're relying on website information. Who is the ultimate sponsor? Are they only sharing one view? And you know there's another view out there, so look for the other view. See what other people are saying.
What's their motivation?
Exactly. What is the motivation? What's the reason why that person is saying that to you? So you want to think about all those kinds of things to become a better critical listener. And then to become a better empathic listener, which probably, I don't know, maybe it's just me because I tend to be that type A problem solver too. But I think that all of us could probably benefit from a lot more empathic listening skills. If I am just trying to be there to help the relationship and to provide empathy and support when someone is sharing information with me, I want to be sure to try to listen non-judgmentally. I don't need to be a critical evaluator there. If all I'm trying to do is be supportive, and my husband gives me a hard time about my mom with this, my mother with dementia, because I am routinely trying to solve her problems when she says, well, why do I need this? Well, you need it because, my husband's like, she's not going to remember it. Why do you even say that? Just say, I don't know, or if you don't want it, it's okay, you know? I don't need to do what I have historically done because she's in a different place. She has a different need. And that's what is important for us to remember. With empathic listening, we want to listen non-judgmentally. We want to focus on maybe feelings rather than what is being said. And we want to communicate our support non-verbally. That's a little bit trickier in this day and age. You know, there is less touching that is deemed appropriate. We just talked about the incident in Michigan. So it's one of those things where it's important to be very, very cognizant of whether or not touch is appropriate, if it needs to be used, if it should be used in a particular situation. And again, it's sad to say, but it doesn't matter what your intent is. What matters is what the receiver perceives. And it becomes a much more difficult scenario now. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, you know, when we see Matt Lauer, and it might be a different area, but the communication of what these people are thinking, they're losing these jobs. I mean, these great communicators.
Yeah.
These are great communicators.
Yeah.
Journalists. The guy on, that I've looked at for years, PBS.
I know, Charlie Rose. I know.
I mean, I'm just trying to figure what.
It's mind-boggling. I think a lot of that is power.
Mm-hmm.
There's another whole lecture we can talk about with regard to power, but when people when people are in positions of power, there is an assumption that they are able to do more or different things. And of course, historically, the whole gender, the women have not been in positions of power, men have. They've yielded their power. I think most of the women in the room can think of instances where, as you think back, someone said something they would never say now, because thankfully we've learned.
Yeah.
Hopefully we've learned. Certainly Matt Lauer and Charlie Rose didn't learn soon enough. Al Franken didn't learn soon enough. There's a lot of people that I think they knew that they were wrong, even as they were doing it, but because they had power and they had the ability to wield power over someone else, and because in the instance of the journalists, they were making money for their organizations, it's easier to turn a blind eye to it.
Yeah,
It's easier to turn a blind eye to it. Yeah.
If you're doing it and it makes you feel even more powerful when you've done it, how could you stop?
Exactly.
Which is just awful.
It is. It absolutely is.
And I know I want to stop, but
Yeah.
what made that turn? Well, then what made the turn? I'm trying to, after all these years, I mean, how did it switch?
It was the Me Too movement. Honestly, it was a couple of people's, and with social media now, it's so much easier to have those kind of groundswell moments.
Okay.
But with some, I don't remember who it was, but someone said, I'm going to talk about this. And then suddenly people were saying, me too, and because then it happened in, I think Roy Moore was one, from Alabama, who suddenly there was more visibility to it. There were instances before. I mean, we know John F. Kennedy had relationships with them, probably did things. I mean, there's all sorts of people in history. Suddenly now, we've hit this sea change, partly because of the prevalence of social media and people saying enough is enough, and people in power realizing that they cannot let that continue.
I think the gender balance has changed.
Yes.
Because I would say, growing up, there was almost a perception that as a guy, if you were successful and have power, and even the president has referred to this, that it gave you certain rights and privileges.
Yes.
And that was a reason to get that power. And once we got past women being just barefoot and pregnant,
Right.
and started getting them more and more into life and balance, some of that stuff just doesn't float anymore.
Yeah, that's exactly
I don't
right.
think we're there, but
Yeah, I
at
was
least
just gonna say that,
we're
yeah.
moving
We are
towards
moving
that.
there. I mean, before we were here, I think if you look at males and females in terms of power balances, it's getting closer.
Yeah.
And those kinds of movements are helping it even get closer. Still, they're uncomfortable.
Well, with
And-
social media, we think we know people and we have this connection that we never would have had with somebody all the way across the country.
Yeah.
And I know stars, people who get people contacting them and saying, you shouldn't parent, or you shouldn't put this picture up, you shouldn't spank your child, you shouldn't feed them that, you shouldn't, it's like, whose business is it? But we feel like we know people because of their media footprint.
Yes, that's exactly right. And we all need to be aware of our media footprint. Most of us don't have the kind of celebrity that others have, but still, when we put a message out there, it's out there for everybody to see. And it conveys a lot. And we've branched now beyond the listening process. And that's what I love about my discipline, the discipline of communication. There's so much you can learn and do with it. Yeah.
First off, I volunteer for Sinclair's College for Lifelong
Oh, yeah.
Registration.
Uh-huh.
But, going on listening, I also take this college courses. They're on
Coursera MOOCs, massive open online courses. Is that what you're talking about on the computer?
Yeah, they're on the computer, but they're also, you can buy them otherwise.
Yeah, there's great books and there's all
Yeah,
there's
great,
great. It's not great
great
books.
courses.
Great courses. That's it. Yeah.
Just got a big one.
I just finished up one on the great mysteries and something else anyway. I skipped quite a few of them because I like cozy mysteries and I don't like police procedurals or the crimes that are committed nowadays.
Yeah.
They're too violent for me.
Yeah.
I like my murders taking place before the detective gets there.
Yeah.
I've not seen all the guts and everything.
Uh-huh.
And but this fellow that teaches it is from Baltimore. He also belongs to the Sherlock Holmes group, and he was going on that these new adaptations, some of them people don't like them, and some he likes the one that was done a few years ago, and I utterly detest it. And he said some people would, and I utterly detest it because I like my Sherlock Holmes back in the times when Bethel Rathbone was in there, and the newer one is sort of, to me, it's Sherlock Holmes meets Miami Vice.
Yeah.
And that, it just, and
Yeah, it's
then,
interesting.
Then he said, then the one that has, who's that, Downey?
Oh, yeah, right.